my new book is actually available for pre-order now, and that's all about the paranormal, and it's called Paranormal Parlor. So it's all about Ouija boards and seances and ghost stories and haunted places and things like that. And it's coming out, and I believe the new published date is June 1st, but it will be, you can buy it pre-order now. And often, like with Amazon, you'll get the book sooner. So I've had people order my book on Amazon and text me and be like, "Oh, the book's so great." And I'm like, "I didn't even get my copy from my publisher yet." So I'm
I
excited
wonder
about
how
that.
long we've been talking. We've been almost a year now, I think, since our first interview, at least coming up. How much of that time have you been working on this book?
So let's see. I'm just looking my book up really quickly right now to see. Oops, I typed in paranormal parrot, which is a totally different thing. They're saying June 1st is when it's going to be available. I'm thinking, okay, so I think the other book had just come out, The Fairies, Pukas, and Changelings. I believe that book had just published, and that was April of last year. So during the thing about when your book gets published is it's actually like about a year, sometimes faster if you are like really famous and they want to crank your book out. But it's generally like a year from the date that you turn the manuscript in until the book is a finished product, anywhere from
Mhm.
like 6 to 8 months average, and sometimes up to a year. And so by the time my other book came out, I was already working on this next manuscript and actually turned that manuscript in about a year ago. So,
So you've got a book in
or a year
development right
ago,
now.
May. It would be a year ago, May.
You're
So
about
what's
done with another book, aren't you?
yeah, so that's the other thing is like so then you have this mad rush to get all this stuff done, and then it's doubled up. So I'm promoting the other book, and my mindset is now moved into this manuscript I'm immersed in,
Hmm.
and all this kind of stuff is happening. And then you turn the manuscript in and you do a couple rounds of edits after your depending on the publisher, but like I get a round of looking at the edits in like the manuscript stage. A copy editor says, "Why are you using these words?" And then you get to argue for or just accept it, or they correct all your grammar. And then there's a round where it's kind of reviewed for by a proofreader, and there's, in my books, there's spot art throughout it, so there's little images. And like in this last round, it looked pretty good, but there were a couple things I really didn't like, so I just, there's no guarantee they're going to be taken out, but I politely request that they be removed. And then there's this lull. Then you're kind of like, what do I do now? And I've been doing double things. I had my deadline at the same time as my promotion of the other book, and now there's this lull, and it's actually very disconcerting because it feels a lot like the calm before the storm. Like whenever you think you're comfortable and you have plenty of time to do anything, a shit's gonna hit the fan in like seconds, right?
Yeah,
so
totally.
I'm I'm actually, I cannot decide what my next book project is going to be, and I've been vacillating between several things, um, and I really haven't completely landed on anything yet. So I'm just giving myself a little bit of time to figure that out, and hopefully by the time this book is out and I get some time to promote it and stuff like that, I'll have a better idea of exactly what I want to do. Or maybe, my publisher will say, "Hey, we thought of this idea for you," which is nice. um, but or I can, say, "I have these 3 ideas. Which of these would you actually consider?" And then they might write back to me and say, "Why don't you send us a full proposal for, A and B? C doesn't sound that interesting." So
This will be like your ninth book, right? Coming up. What are
is
you
it?
close? Is it nine now or is it 10
Let's
that
see.
you're
I've
going to be
got the
writing?
2 books for the Bazaar. I've got Banshees. I've got Mermaids. I've got Fairies. This one is 6, and then there's a couple of older books that I don't really talk about too much. So yeah, I guess
How
this is
are you
ninth.
involved with the Netflix Mermaid television show that's going to be coming out?
I didn't even know about it. Why didn't they consult me?
That is my problem. Why didn't you get consulted? You own mermaids now.
I don't know about this. Mermaid Netflix. I didn't Is it a show, like a series?
Yeah, I think so. Did you look it up?
So many things came up when I typed in mermaid Netflix. I might need to narrow that down a little bit.
H2O, is that what it is? Oh,
Oh,
Mermaid Adventure?
is it a kid show?
Nope, it is not.
Oh, because I was going to say, if it's a kid show, that's why they consult
I
me.
wouldn't
They
have mentioned
don't
it.
want to poison the hearts and minds of anyone under the age of 13 at this point.
Right? I mean, I guess it looked wicked though. I mean, it showed the mermaids being kind
Is it
of
called
evil
The
creatures.
Mermaid?
It would make
Uh,
sense that that's what it's called. Why does Netflix hate my computer?
this is why I don't like the Google, because it's very subjective. Well, I see something that says The Mermaid in 2016, but it looks like it's
Well, this is 2018.
well, let me type
You
in
bumped your head really,
2018.
really hard.
We're already totally sidebarring here. Is it called Mako Mermaids?
I don't know because I saw that one too, and that doesn't make any sense because it looks like a kid movie, a kid shit, and it's got 4 seasons. So no,
Okay, well, obviously I wasn't consulted and we need to revisit this.
I gotta stop taking mushrooms and
Are
watching
they
Netflix.
I know, are they Oh, I also see something here that says The Little Mermaid, an upcoming live action fantasy adventure
Oh,
film loosely based on the original Hans Christian Andersen. And that says 2018. And that would be exciting if they actually made The Little Mermaid as it truly is, because it's a brutal, brutal story.
is it Netflix?
Um, it didn't come up when I typed in Netflix, but when I just typed in Mermaid Movie 2018, it said this is upcoming. Shirley
Yeah,
MacLaine is in
Netflix.
it. That's exciting. That
So
makes it worth it right there.
what is the
Um,
Hans
yeah,
Christian
it's
Andersen
just picked
version
up
of
for distribution by Netflix. Yes, so this is it. So this is what you're talking about. So it's
it
The
looks
Little
like
Mermaid. So it's actually based on
it
the
looks
original
brutal.
story.
It looks
Now
evil.
that original story is one of the stories that when people ask me, what is your favorite folk tale? That is one of the stories that I remember as a young child. My mom didn't censor the fairy and folk tales, the real original ones. She read them straight from the book, and there's a lot of death and mayhem, and it's essentially the plot that we all are familiar with the Disney version, which is that there's a mermaid and she wants to live upon land. She falls in love with the prince. He visits her at the seaside. They fall in love, and she has to make the choice of whether or not she will stay beneath the sea or she will go and be with him. But it's not just like, I think in the Disney version, like she can't talk or something like that, that she loses her voice, the sea witch takes her voice. That's not in the book. In the book, there's this description that has always haunted me of her coming out of the sea, and in order to be able to walk on her two legs, which this witch does give her that ability, every step she takes is like daggers stabbing into her feet.
Yeah,
So
we've talked about that before, haven't
she's in
we?
like anguish and pain the whole time. So there's a lot of like sort of brutal descriptions like that in the original story. And I don't remember, I don't remember there being, well, obviously there's not cheery little lobster pals and things like that. There's no
I think it
companions.
was a crab.
But it's kind of, I guess it's, if you think of it, it's that sort of choice. And in this case, it's a young woman and the choice she has to make between her family and the life that she's always known and that she's been happy in, and then the kind of transition into like being a wife and a bride. And if you get real deep and start thinking about it, you can actually kind of think of it as an allegory for a woman going into, or a young girl turning into a woman, and all of the pain that is associated. Her
Oh, that's
feet would
interesting.
bleed and they would cramp,
See, that's what I like
right?
talking about
Now, I don't
with
know that
stuff like
Hans
you.
Christian Andersen set out to write a story that was an allegory for, a girl's first
Menstruation,
menstruation,
becoming
but
becoming a woman.
he
That was his entire
also
attention.
that's not his original story. This is an old tale that he put to paper, and
Yeah,
he had his own sort of take on it and his
yeah.
own
They copied down
agenda.
oral traditions, didn't they?
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, there's a whole kind of like thing about her choosing to be with him, and it's painful, and there's blood involved, and it's agonizing, and she has to
Huh.
leave her father, and all of this kind of stuff that, especially back in the day, that was what a woman did. They went from
Huh.
their childhood
Love it.
home straight to
Wow.
the home of their husband, or yeah, I mean, that was pretty much what you did. You didn't go and strike out on your own and, live in San Francisco and yuck it up with all the trannies for a few years like yours truly. You had to like yeah, before you became settled down. You didn't have that option really, unless you worked a life of servitude, and then you eventually, by 22, you were a spinster. So
Right. That's horrible. What now, did you write about what was your book about?
my mermaid book,
Yeah.
it's about so I talk about the Little Mermaid in there, but my aim with that book was to kind of shed some light on the darker side of the mermaid stories, so that we're not all, singing calypso when we think of mermaids, but the early Irish accounts of the Murrow, and the sort of the desire that mermaids have to drown you. And I also talk about a couple of, sort of like mermaid activists, some different people who have the ability to see really well underwater, like the Moken people who are in the South Pacific. They have better underwater vision than they have um, on dry land. And that
Isn't
comes
that
from a
scientifically
lifetime of hunting under the
hunting?
sea, and
Interesting. So it's just exercising those small little tiny muscles.
yeah, and like, hundreds of years of adaptation. There's also the Haneo women who are off the coast of Korea, and they can hold their breath underwater. It's all women, and they train generation after generation to skin dive, to basically dive down with no equipment. Sometimes I think they wear wetsuits in these days, but no tank or anything like that, to depths of like 30 meters or more, and some of them can hold their breath underwater for like 10 minutes. And this is something that they train their bodies for, just like you can train for a marathon. So I talk about that, and how that kind of leads to the idea that this idea of mermaids being really unbelievable actually can, when you start looking at it through that lens, okay, if a regular human today is able to adapt their body to be able to do that, then who's to say that that's not something that has always existed? So I
There,
talk about that, and
I was watching a podcast on YouTube not 5 minutes before I got on this with you, and it was about this Navy SEAL. Basically, decided he was going to do ultra marathons, and the reason that he was successful is able to compartmentalize his pain, shove his discomfort into like a little tiny room, and you know, mental toughness is not unique to him, but his ability to do that will continue on with his children. And it's got to be a part of his DNA.
right, the ability to be able to do that, and then you can hone that and adapt to that as, generation after generation. But yeah, there's some kind of genetic predisposition to be able to do that. So anyway, the book itself is a collection of all of these things. So it's a collection of folklore, real mermaids. I had actually a couple people tell me about their own mermaid encounters, or encounters. There's also snippets of beautiful fiction, and just some delightful old kind of accounts of mermaids and aquariums and aquatic creatures. And I've got some weird facts about the sea, and squids and things like that in there, just for sprinkled in there for fun. So
Curious about the people who actually have
it's actually
witnessed.
my best-selling book. That book does,
Really?
yeah, it's the
There
best.
isn't a lot about mermaids. I'm sitting here listening to you talk, trying to think of their movies and experiences. I think I've come up with like
Splash.
Splash and the Little
Um,
Mermaid and
and Mr. Peabody and the Mermaid, which is kind of the original Splash. That's the best one of them all. That's
I'm
the
just
story.
thinking of the European explorers who thought that manatees were freaking mermaids and
Yeah,
trying to figure out
right. And the
how that worked.
scurvy. Well, and Blackbeard was actually said to be afraid of mermaids, and there was a stretch of coast, I think, kind of off the coast of Georgia, where he would steer they were mermaid infested waters, and he would steer his crewmates, steer the ships clear of it for fear that his, shipmates would just jump ship to be with the mermaids, or that the mermaids would cause a wreck and a distraction. And so there was a lot of fear of mermaids, but you also do have like manatees and dugongs, creatures that people had never seen the likes of. And you've been at sea for a really long time. You probably very malnourished, and you've got scurvy and all manner of things, and you look out and you see something. I swear that was a beautiful woman. I'm just going to jump into the water, which is the thing you cannot do when you're out at sea.
Where do
So
they come from though? And like at the beginning of literature, I'm thinking back to the Odyssey. Like maybe there were
mhm.
mermaids there, or they were not mermaids.
Yes.
They were
There are sirens in the Odyssey,
sirens.
and
Yeah.
there's very similar. And I include sirens in my book because I do think of sirens and selkies kind of all under the grand category of mermaids. They are different creatures, but
Silkies are Irish, right?
yes, and they're seals. So they appear as seals rather than like a woman or a fish. They are a seal that can take off its coat and come onto land and marry a man and have children with him. And I've never heard of a male selkie, although I'm sure there are accounts of them if you dug deep enough. But they're typically female. They have beautiful voices, which is another connection with mermaids and sirens. The kind of ability to sing and lull someone either away from the rocks or toward the rocks. Kind of throw them off. But in the Odyssey, you have the sirens, and they're doing their kind of enchanting song. But you have you have like really early examples of mermaids in mythology. Um, you can go there. There's stuff like that goes engravings and things like that go back to as far as like 1000 BC. That there's like actual evidence and stories. There's an Assyrian goddess named Atagatis, and it is she. So this story dates her like around 1000 BC, and she killed a man that she loved, a mortal man. She was a goddess, and then she tried to hide herself in the waters. And then when she couldn't hide in the water, she turned herself into a creature that was half woman, half fish, so that she could hide. And they say that that's one of the first mermaids and one of the first mermaid stories. But you'll see, very old engravings and images throughout different cultures. You'll find them throughout the Mediterranean. Pretty much anywhere that there's a large body of water, you'll find
Mhm.
some kind of creature like that. And you'll also find accounts of things like it's not always just mermaids or mermen or merrow, as they're called, which is kind of the Irish term for the sea creatures. You'll also find like were dolphins and other kind of really interesting kind of shape-shifting, half dolphin, half ravenous werewolf, dangerous creatures. Or you have a lot of stories, especially in like island nations like Aboriginal Australia and New Zealand, of mermaids being something that you respect and you make offerings to, and they're sort of like a goddess, like you would have made an offering to Gaia or something like that. So you have a lot of instances of that. And if you think about it, just on a logical, not even on a mythological side, but from a logical point of view, if you are surrounded by a huge body of water, you need to believe that there's a way to tame it or protect
Yeah.
yourself. And you need to be able to explain the shipwrecks and the tragedy and the hurricanes and things like that.
Mhm.
And that's true of other disasters throughout time and history can be attributed to gods or goddesses, or stories of how the Grand Canyon was formed, or whatever you have.
Well, humans
And
love the beach. We love the shoreline. We look for
we
water.
do.
I mean, that's
We
where,
do.
yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's something, so it's funny because I think that mermaids are widely worshipped and adored, but seldom actually believed in. I mean, it's like people like me and a lot of little girls are like, mermaids are real. But all of the like, even a lot of the, I've been on shows where, you've got somebody who claims that an alien abducted them, and they're like, okay, this lady's crazy. She's saying mermaids are real. And so, there's, dare I say, a line in the sand that people draw. They think, oh, I'm not going to admit that there's such thing as mermaids, but you will find so much evidence of, beautiful stories. And it all makes sense when you think about it. Like I said, I'm a believer, but if you think of it, even from a more logical standpoint, they're just as likely to exist as any other god or goddess or mythological creature throughout time. So,
Well, you're a believer in the sense of the literary exploration of the subject itself. You understand that they exist because of people trying to make an explanation for something.
no, I actually think that there are, or at one time were, mermaids. I do. I absolutely do. I don't think I'm going to go like out and like encounter one, but I have to hold on to that belief that it's possible.
Well, we crawled from the water ourselves. I mean, we're whatever we
Look at the
are,
crazy
fish.
things they find. I mean, they finally get a camera down into the crack in the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, and some insane creature pops out that you've never
Or
seen
that, I mean,
before.
a
Or
shipwreck 200 years ago gets buried by sediment and you never see it again. So, I mean, if humans and some kind of sea creature were at war, why wouldn't the same thing that happened to us? We're crawled up on land. Another creature kind of just stayed in the
I mean,
water.
we evolved from primordial ooze at one point.
We're
Perhaps
all
these
related.
stories go back all that
Yeah,
way to
right.
like our aquatic beginnings, and we have this kind of like inherited, mental impression of it that we can't even. It's like in our subconscious. It's like our
I mean, what
our
is it? It's based on
understanding of that.
survival anyway. Everything is calorie intake, sex, the whole shebang, and doing that stuff kind of sticks with you. That's why we like
Well, and
sweets.
if you think about, I mean, just thinking of how vast the ocean is, and we think we've explored and we've conquered everything.
But no,
But
we
there
haven't.
was a time when people
Not
pooped on
when it
the
comes
ice
to the
of the
ocean.
kraken, or
Yeah.
these like giant fish, or these giant sea serpents, or whatever. And then some huge giant like oarfish washes up on the beach in Malibu, and everybody's like, "Oh my God, that looks like a sea serpent from this old map." I mean, this happened a few years ago. It's just an oarfish that had lived for a very long time and got really big, like 15
Yeah.
feet long. But imagine if you're out at sea and you see this thing. Okay, now you have to just remember what you saw and draw it, and you put it on this map, and then it's going to get a little bigger and a little scarier and a little more fearsome. And that's why you had to flee with all the gold or whatever. But you also have, there's like the giant Pacific octopus that is actually quite aggressive and has been known to reach its tentacles up onto small fishing boats and try and pull the boat down and capsize the boat. So it's not without reason that these stories exist. I mean, they're not necessarily all. And what I love about this kind of stuff, though, is that you can't actually say one way or the other for certain. You cannot
You know
completely
what you
rule it
can
out.
say 100% certain is that people have been largely illiterate working their way up into the 21st century. Even in the 21st century, there's a large population of the world that cannot read. So, I
Right.
mean, they're not coming up with, scientific answers for the things that are happening around them. They're not, sitting down and trying to rationalize it. They have to come up, there's a monster, and the story has to spawn from that for them to
Well,
make sense of
and
the activity,
yes,
whatever's happening.
and I think that we have, on many occasions, spent a lot of money and time and research proving something that, the original people have been saying all along. And
Like,
that happens with botanicals and medicine.
mhm.
That happens with there's this wonderful story from the Pacific Northwest about how the people didn't come over a land bridge or anything. Kind of, they basically were born out of this giant clamshell, and the crow pulled them out of this clamshell, and the clamshell was essentially like, this was since time immemorial. Well, that they're saying, well, it goes back, 6,000, 10,000 years. And then the archaeological record is saying, actually, we don't have any evidence to support that. And then 2 years ago, they found a skeleton in a cave in the Pacific Northwest, and they carbon dated it back like 4,000 years earlier than anyone had that archaeological evidence.
What is
And the
it, like
natives are just like, yeah, we
Clovis
told
man,
you
right?
we've been here forever. How long do you think forever has to be? When are you actually going to listen to us?
A Clovis man in Clovis, New Mexico.
Clovis,
They
man.
found
Oh, right, right.
right. I don't know how old that is.
It's interesting that
37,000 years ago. No, I
it's
have no
interesting
clue
that we're
what that
kind
is.
of talking about mermaids because this thing kind of popped up in um, my Facebook feed. It does like the memories or whatever. And I
Mm.
had done a talk, and I was actually, what is it, 2018? So it's 4 years ago, like this week, I did this talk, and it was for this organization that I get together with. And I'm a fellow of, it's called Odd Salon, and I'm a member, I'm an Odd Fellow. And they do these, like, you'd love it. It's weird talks about real things, history and science and folklore and all these different things, but there's always sort of like a theme for each event. And the theme, that it was the first time I had talked for them, and the theme was actually fake. And I talked about mermaids, and I talked about P.T. Barnum's kind of a fake Fiji mermaid, where he sewed together this couple carcasses and laid it out and charged people money. And then, by the time they got to the other side of the tent, it was too late. No refunds, whether you think that's real or not. And it became this whole kind of sensational thing. But then on the flip side of that, we have all of these really weird things like a blobfish, or there's just all kinds of creatures under the sea that if I described it to you, you would think I was lying. You would think I made it up. It basically looks like a gelatinous bowl of upturned jello, but it has a round nose like Jimmy Durante. I mean, like, you would think I was lying, and yet this creature exists, right? So it was kind of fun, because that was just sort of the juxtaposition, was like, here are the real things that look fake, and then here are the fake things that everybody thought were real. It's kind of an interesting, and with mermaids, it comes up all the time. It comes up a lot with other magical creatures, of course, werewolves especially.
Mm.
But mermaids, not ghosts, people tend to believe in more, because more people have had ghostly encounters. In fact, I think you'll find that once you start asking around, there's a majority of people who have had some kind of, can't quite put my finger on it. They don't necessarily always want to call it a ghost, but they've had some kind of supernatural or paranormal experience that they can't quite explain.
I never put two and two together, but when you're talking about ghosts, you're actually talking about an afterlife, which is quite fascinating, honestly.
Yes, and the whole what a huge part of this book that my favorite part of the book that is coming out is a whole chapter that's kind of dedicated to some key players in something called the spiritualist movement,
Mm-hmm.
which was essentially from the late Victorian era, I think, like, or mid to late. So it's like 1840 to like 1920. This was a movement especially in the UK, some parts of Europe, and throughout the United States. And it was not just the belief that there was an afterlife, but it was the belief that the afterlife could communicate with certain people, certain living people, that the dead could communicate with the living specifically. Now, this isn't an entirely new concept, right? Because people have been consulting oracles and, channeling entities and talking to spirits since, before they figured out how to light a fire. But what was significant about this is that it actually was kind of in the middle to upper class echelon of society. And so you had all of these otherwise, and not necessarily people who were Christian, but they wouldn't believe in. I mean, it was people of all from all walks of life who did have a lot of other spiritual beliefs, and they began to kind of become obsessed with this idea that you could communicate with the dead, and that's where you got like the parlor games, the spirit board, the seances became incredibly popular. You had people channeling materials and poems and publishing books through channeling. And
That's really fascinating as well. The
yeah,
Mark Twain story that you told me a few
right.
podcasts ago.
So this is all like kind of that same movement. And it was really probably one of the first times when the belief in the afterlife wasn't purely based on superstition as it had been, in years prior. So you had these people who were educated, literate, scientists, doctors. It was happening in the White House. I mean, it was like people who were considered to be upstanding members of society who were saying, oh yes, it's entirely possible that this woman is actually channeling, the
Mary Todd Lincoln was.
yeah, Mary Todd Lincoln had seances.
Yeah.
And it it's not surprising because I think
Yeah.
we had
We
a
talked
whole
about the
podcast
death,
that we
right?
talked about Frankenstein too, and we
Oh
talked
yeah.
about like
The
Mary
resurrection.
Shelley's obsession with resurrection and how that was born from so much loss and so much
How the
wondering.
parlor was where they put the dead people, and the living room was where the living actually hung out while the funeral was taking place, because there was
Right.
constantly a funeral rolling through the house.
Right. Well, and that's what you did. You didn't necessarily have a funeral home. Not every town had that. So it was usually the person who had the nicest parlor, the wealthiest people. So it might have been a hotel. It might have been, the mayor or someone. And if you were an upstanding member of society, the wake may be held there and people would come in and, hang out. And I talk about that a little bit in this new book as well. There's a chapter that now that is actually could probably become a whole book in and of itself, but sort of odd death customs,
Mm.
such
Oh
as
my God.
the
Okay,
thing where you eat bread off of the corpse.
I've got you. I've got one even worse than that, but go ahead. Tell me
Oh,
about the
okay.
bread.
Okay, so they're called corpse eaters.
Oh,
And at times
it's
they
so
were
funny how that disgusts me, right? But everybody eventually does die. The idea of the rotting or the newly deceased, it makes me like my stomach kind of quease up a little bit.
well, there's something about putting the word corpse and eat together in the
Right? I
same
guess that does
phrase
too.
that's probably what's turning your stomach. So what a corpse eater was though, and it could be that it was a member of the family, but more often than not, if you could afford to, there was sort of the guy on the outskirts of society, much like the grave digger, who was paid to be the corpse eater. And this was very, very common in Wales, especially. This was a tradition in
Interesting.
which you would lay the body out. And then, as part of the ablations of, the body is cleaned and the petties are on the eyes or whatever kind of thing, so the corpse is dressed. And then the person would take and put bread on the corpse. And then the professional corpse eater, or it was a member of the family, or it was the local witch or whoever would do it, would come and eat that bread. And I guess it was kind of a way of removing the spirit from the body entirely, because people didn't always believe that the spirit left immediately. They wanted to make sure that the spirit was cleansed from the body and that it went well on its way and on its passage. And so people have, of course, all of these rituals. But the
Hmm.
corpse eater was sort of this like professional person. You'd throw him a few pennies and he would eat that like the bread off of the chest of the dead body.
It's interesting. I'd like to know more about him. Like, does he go around to funerals? Is he
Yeah,
the
so
regional
I
corpse
felt
eater guy?
I felt like when I was reading the different accounts about these corpse eaters and the practices, when it got to the part where it kind of said like, or you can hire a corpse eater, to me, like I immediately got like the Hunchback of Notre Dame in my mind. Like it was somebody who maybe couldn't make a living doing other things. It was kind of on the outskirts of society. You know, there's one in every social group, right? There's like that person that, you know, they live alone, they're kind of a pauper, they'll kind of do whatever for money, right? So that's the person that you hire to, you know, dig the grave, and then the person that you hire to eat the corpse. I mean, they could have made a very decent living at it, and it could have been
Right.
a very valued profession.
I think grave diggers are a little bit rich in that time frame.
Grave diggers, you know, I mean, yeah, you could make. Not only are you constantly in, you know, constant
Demand.
in demand, but you also have your pick of the spoils after hours, you know. And then
That's
that's the
true.
whole. You get the whole thing where you know, grave diggers also would be sort of bribed by upstanding people like doctors, especially in like the 1600s. Doctors were trying so hard to um, learn more about the body, but you couldn't, because of the Catholic Church especially, you couldn't just mess around with a body after it died. That was not allowed. That was punishable. That was against the law. So in order to learn more about the body, you know, obviously you're not going to be able to operate on a living person. So you had to get this, you know, or to, in order to be able to perform those medical procedures, you had to have corpses. And so bodies were robbed and laid out. And, you know, that's how we have a lot of the medical knowledge that we have today. And that was very
You know what's
common.
interesting? Still, religious rights groups are trying to put the kibosh on educating ourselves about what the potential is of the human body with stem cell
Is they're still
research being, or cloning
they're
being
still
outlawed.
banning books that they think promote witchcraft. So children's books, you know. So
Yeah.
it doesn't.
I
I was
mean, when
just
you say it like that, it gets even dumber than preventing stem cell
right,
research. And
like a Wrinkle in Time. You know, I was just reading about all these different banned children's books, and it was like, you know, 50 banned children's books that your kids should read. And I thought, why a Wrinkle in Time? I read a Wrinkle in Time when I was. What about that would lead it to be banned? And apparently, it was banned fairly recently in like the 80s and 90s for being basically promoting witchcraft, promoting the idea that there was something other than just one God. Well, all
ridiculous.
literature explores that, right?
Yeah.
Like, except the Bible. So it just seems like it was shocking to me that I understand that this happens and has been happening for hundreds of years, but to see a book like that I knew the content of, that would like that never even occurred to me. But then again, I read it and look how I turned out. So, you know,
You're on my podcast.
I read a lot
Congratulations.
of dark, evil things, you know, about
Yeah. Have you ever heard of a sky funeral?
no.
Oh my God. This is probably the most horrid thing I've ever seen. A person dies and they take his body out to a field and basically they prepare it by scoring the flesh down to the bone. They leave it in the middle of this field. They walk away and they allow the vultures to devour the family member, I guess, right down to the bones. And then a person, you know, I guess I consider him like a pallbearer or something, will take the bones and start beating them down into a pulpy mess and then leaving those out for the vultures to pick clean. And they call it a sky funeral.
Wow.
It's illegal in Canada.
Is it legal here?
I have no earthly idea.
Okay, so I don't know if you've ever heard the podcast Criminal. Have you heard that podcast? It's a
No.
it's a wonderful podcast. It explores the idea of crime, but not necessarily like, oh, this is a true crime podcast. I mean, it's about true crimes, but it takes a very kind of um, liberal definition of criminal. And so you might hear about somebody who made a law change or a strange law that was in effect, or in any case, this is actually about this place. It's a body farm. And what it is,
Oh, I've
have
seen
you heard of
this. The
body
body
farm?
farm where the people they basically plant humans to see how they decompose in various.
Yes, and they
Yeah.
use it for forensic science. So it's used for forensic science, and it's used to be able to see, okay, if a body were out and, you have, okay, this person was wearing, this kind of fabric, and here's their body, and okay, now this bone is over here, to give them an idea of like, if a body were left out, where should they be looking? What kind of state of composition? What will that tell us about how long ago the person died, how they died, who may have killed them, all those kind of things. But in the podcast, she's this very composed, lovely, lovely interviewer. And she goes to this body farm. There's one in Colorado. There's a few of them. And you can donate your body to this. Like, you can donate your body to science. You can specify that you want to go to this body farm, and they'll take your body there. And yeah, so it's beyond just donating it to science. You're donating it to forensic science. And she actually is, so you can hear in her voice as she's, but like, she just doesn't even have the words anymore, because she is standing in this field where there are dead bodies in various states of composition, and some of them are propped up and some of them are laid, I mean, it's a eerie thing. But I had never heard of that. I mean, I knew that there must be something like that, just because how else would you ever know, other than like, I mean, how would you really know what a body does unless you've observed it? So, but yeah, it was a very, very kind of haunting idea. And there was this little part of me that was like, that's kind of a fun thing to plan for your death. Like,
being in a body farm. Yeah. I mean,
like, oh, body farm. People will learn from my demise.
what bodies do when they're decomposing. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating. There's been 117 billion human beings.
I don't know that I would want to observe it personally. I'm interested in it from a, more of a fascinating storyteller's point of view, not from I really want to like go for a walk. And, I dated plenty of guys that like to watch those, like, near death videos and stuff like that.
Oh,
it's just like, what, dudes, this is not interesting.
There's a subreddit called Watch People Die.
Yeah, it's like, this is not, I don't need to see this. Some things are just too sacred. But
I mean, death is the end goal of living, right? I mean, at the end of the day, that's what will happen to us all. And
yeah, I don't know if you've ever read Leonard Shlain, but he wrote, God, now I've forgotten all the books that he wrote. He wrote the big one called it's called Sex, Time, and I'm gonna have to look it up, because it became a bestseller. I'm sure you will have heard of it. Anyway, in one of his books, he talks about, and he was an anthropologist, Leonard Shlain books, and he talks about how it was actually that. So he wrote The Alphabet versus the Goddess, Sex, Time, and Power. That's the one I read. I read, and The Alphabet versus the Goddess was, I think, one of his best-selling books. But Sex, Time, and Power, I read that book, and what he talks about in there is kind of like the tipping point for people to become conscious of death, and what that actually did. It was kind of the point at which we then started to create, because we became aware that that there was an end. And as soon as we know there was an end, we started to strive to leave our mark. And so that's how art was born. And that's how, the desire to procreate. I mean, the desire to procreate was sort of an instinctive thing, but there was a point at which he kind of describes it as like, early man loses understands that something precious to them that they love, like their child, dies. And at that point, they start memorializing it, and they start to create art, and they start to do something to make your mark, so that whatever you do, you can cheat death, because you are immortal now, because your name lives on after you die. Now, I didn't agree with everything that he wrote in that book, but it was such a cool way of thinking about it. And it does make a lot of sense, because, I mean, it's true. You think about any society, going back thousands of years, and you'll find evidence of art, some kind of burial ritual, something that says
Something that
we
marks the
were
passage of your
here,
life.
right? We were
Yeah,
here. Yeah.
this is the period.
Yeah.
This is the end of it. This is what happens now. I'm dead. This is the last chapter of my book. Is this whatever
Yeah. Remember me.
headstone statue,
Remember me to them.
cave, cave wall drawing? Yeah, absolutely. Death is an entirely interesting subject. I mean, what we got on it talking about ghosts being kind of the next level or potentially another afterlife. And then you said something interesting where, you get to talk to all these people with their ghost stories. And I was curious, what would be a story that you've heard that really gave you a sense of afterlife, like death beyond something beyond death?
Well, I mean, I've had a lot of experiences myself. And what's funny is that whenever people ask me ghost stories, I always end up telling somebody else's ghost story.
Mm.
And I actually sat down, and as I was writing the book, I realized that, I was like, I guess I could tell about that one time, or I could tell about that one time. And I realized how many experiences I had had, in which I had felt or, had something very, you know, eerie or unexplainable happen. But I
But did
think
you
in
ever
terms,
did you ever get a sense of the afterlife though in those experiences, or was it just more like, oh, this is weird and scary and whatnot?
like, what is this? Could this be a ghost?
No, is this
Um,
after death? I mean, that's basically the echo that I'm looking for. Like,
what would the difference be? I mean,
I don't know, because I listen to a
something
lot of
just
like
invisible that actually never died and never lived, like just
I've
something that creates things and moves objects and
mm-mm,
taps you on the
like a
forehead
near
and
death experience
oh,
type
like a near death
situation.
experience. I mean, I have had a near death experience, but it wasn't a near death experience the way like I did almost die at one point in my life. And but I didn't have a like tunnel or anything like that. I've never had anything like that. Um and I didn't really talk to too many people about near death experiences. I mean, that's a whole topic in and of itself. There are people you can dedicate an entire book, and people have, just to exploring near death experiences. I'm more interested in like hauntings, and not necessarily that
The
that's
actual death experience.
yeah, I'm not that interested in the actual death experience. I figure I'll get to that when maybe as I mature, I'll be more interested in that. And those stories fascinate me, and I'd like to hear about those stories. I do enjoy hearing about them, but that's not a passion of mine. I'm more dedicated to sort of evidence of something other than humans moving things about, tapping people, manifesting, leaving messages, scaring people.
The after death experience.
Yeah, the after death experience, trying to communicate with the living, and that relationship between the living and the dead in like a very Beetlejuicy kind of way, you know?
Ultimately, the most disappointing story that comes out of that is Houdini's wife, right? I mean, he promised her that he would come to
It's so interesting because I've totally, like, my mom and I have had this conversation multiple times of like, what are you what like I let's talk about what a sign would be. Let's narrow down a few things you think you might be able to do, so that we can then say, okay, this is okay, that was definitely mom. And who knows if we'll be able to pull that off. But and I talk about that with like a couple of my sisters too. Sometimes we're like, okay, if I die, this is how you're gonna know. But
Well, you've actually experienced ghosts and hauntings and heard people talk. So I mean, if you were going to give somebody a signal from after death or something along those lines, what would
mm,
a ghost give? What are some typical
like,
things that
what
you
would
could do
I
as a
do?
ghost to communicate?
What would I do? I mean,
Like
because you do get
ghost,
a lot of like lights flickering, any kind of messing with electronic devices, and especially clocks or watches tend to be a good conduit. Sometimes books can be moved or pushed around. You definitely have like any kind of like jewelry or something that has a lot of strong energy to it that was important to you or important to the deceased could be, it could go missing and then reappear or things like that. Of course, we could also blame the hobgoblins for that, but
Yeah,
we're
this could be
sticking with
anything,
ghosts
right?
right now. But there are also, smells it's not just physical things. It can be, like for me, I have experienced on numerous occasions, in fact, the night after the night that very dear friend of mine died. And I was with her son at the time. I woke in the middle, and she had passed about 4 or 5 hours before, and we had finally gone back to another friend's place and getting, ready for bed and laying down and everything. And I smelled this perfume that was not in the room. I didn't smell it before, and it lasted about a minute, and then the smell kind of went away. And it was a very like beautiful, gardeny, like wild rose kind of smell. And I've
Did she
heard
smell
other
like that in life? Your friend?
um it wasn't necessarily a smell I associated 100% with her, like that's her signature perfume.
Mhm.
But as soon as I smelled it, I knew. I knew that that was her kind of like cruising over the house or whatever she was doing, because it was so distinct and I couldn't put my finger on what else it was. And I had since then heard I've had yeah, in I think the second bizarre book, I put a story that a man called in and to Coast when I was on for the first book of the Bazaar, and he told me this beautiful story, and we kept in touch, and I asked him if I could put it in the next book, and it was where he then he kept smelling his mother's perfume. So it can be a sensation like that where you so there's different, they call it there's like clairsentient, clairaudient, and clairvoyance. And a clairvoyant can often see, hear, feel, and identify spirits. A clairsentient may only be able to tell one of those things, like one of the senses, in particular, smells. Or then you have a clairaudience, which is somebody who is able to hear ghosts or hear like noises that are thought to be from spirit communicating, but can't necessarily see them, doesn't necessarily have a physical manifestation. So all of those kind of stories are, I mean, they're interesting to me. I haven't had too many physical manifestate, like a spooky thing like floating in my room or whatever. I had a couple when I was a kid, but when I was interviewing people, one of my favorite ones was this story from this wonderful man. His name is Jeff Belanger, and he's a writer, and he's a podcaster, and he hosts like Haunted America and a bunch of different cool paranormal shows. And he just hiked Mount Kilimanjaro. He's just basically an amazing guy. And I've always been a fan of, he's done like Haunted America, and he's just gotten stories from like every single place in the United States. And he told me a story that is in the book, and it's a beautiful story about being in the catacombs of Paris. And
That place
actually,
isn't haunted though, right? I mean, what? It'd be like
so
the
the
worst
catacombs
place.
of Paris are basically lined with
The
skeletons. I
bones
mean, the
of dead
halls
people.
are lined with
Centuries and
skulls.
centuries.
Yeah. But he actually was there because he liked freaky things and weird things, and he had been interested in like the paranormal and stuff like that. But what was interesting to me about this story is that although he had spent so much time researching and kind of investigating and writing about the paranormal at that point in his life, he had never had any kind of experience. He had never seen a ghost. He had never heard a ghost. He had never actually had his own paranormal experience. And when he was there in the catacombs, he saw this man. And I don't want to reveal the whole story because you have to buy the book to read it. But it was he saw this man, and
That's the
there
book that's
was
coming
no
out
way the guy
in
came
June.
past him. That's the book that's coming out in June. There's no way the guy passed him. There was no way the guy, couldn't have gone back by him. And he describes the hat that he was wearing, and he said that was actually for him the turning point in which he went from being a skeptic who was interested in the topic to being a believer. And that was kind of that changed the approach that I don't know if it changed his approach, but it changed him. And it's a very intimate story, which I was quite honored to include. And also, he's an amazing storyteller. So as he's telling me, he's putting in all these details. I mean, he told it to me over the phone, and I was like, why am I not recording this? Like, I'm taking notes and thinking like all these turns of phrases. It was a beautiful, beautiful story, and it's one of my favorites in the book. And it's interesting to me because I found it. Here's somebody that's been, in the field for 20 something years.
Mhm.
And I just assumed he is, like me, seen and heard things since he was a kid. And he was like, actually, I remember friends who had haunted houses and quite frankly being a little jealous of them. But I never had that experience until I was, a bona fide adult. So
You said you've had experiences since you were a little kid.
yeah. Yeah, so I mean, my mom, I mean, a big part of it, I think, is the environment in which you're raised. And we've talked about this a bit of this, like, if you're told, if you're taken to church every Sunday, you're going to
Yeah.
believe in church or whatever church people believe. You know what I mean? So, and I wasn't, but I never felt that my mom was overt with the psychic arts or anything like that, but
Hmm.
they were certainly a part of my life. I mean, we read tarot cards when I was little. Those things were always around. She was always reading for her friends. She had a shelf of occult books. Has a shelf of occult books that I read at a young age, including things like Diary of a Witch by Sybil Leek, which I read when I was an impressionable 12-year-old. Nothing inappropriate there, but it talks about a lot of occult subjects that were certainly beyond me. So I always kind of had this exposure to that. But I had a couple of experiences in fact, I had a kind of a creepy, well, I didn't realize it was creepy at the time, but there's a story, and I put this in the book, where the there's a grave on the property next to my parents, a lone grave of a little girl.
What
And
year?
I'm sorry.
Old? What year?
She was like 7 when she died, and I believe she died in like 1869 or
So
something like
she's
that.
buried out there.
Yes, and but the thing is so my parents, where they live in Northern California in gold country, and up, a rural road. And there's a couple of towns that used to exist that don't exist anymore. And where my parents live, there actually used to be an old hotel that burned down on their property. It didn't burn when this was back in probably the 1850s during the Great Gold Rush in California. And there's a watering trough for horses and old apple trees and things like that have kind of all fallen to the wayside now, but were there, an old a mine shaft. But the road itself, which would have been a pretty, dusty old road, eventually led up the hill to some very, very big mines, some like major mines in a couple of pretty established towns at the time. That a lot of money was to be made there. But it's confusing because you find this one lone grave, and it's a beautiful marble headstone and a marble footstone, and there are no other graves around it. So it's just this grave of this beloved child, but it's not a family plot. No one else died and was buried there. There's no other evidence of like a cemetery there. So it's kind of got this great mystery. Now, we didn't know about this. We had lived there for a few years, and our neighbor had peacocks. And so her peacock got lost, and she was wandering through the woods trying to find her peacock, calling for it, and came upon this grave. It was sort of like, the next property over, which somebody owned, but that person was never there, and it was very overgrown. And so she told my mom about it. Well, around that time, my sister and I guess we were probably 8 and 9 or 9 and 10 or something like that. We were playing with the Ouija board. We'd play with it pretty frequently and just play with it during the day. My mother had given us one for Christmas or whatever. And so we were just playing with it. And then one day we're playing around with it, and it did something like, I can't remember what we asked it, but it's spelled, and my mom wasn't playing it with us. She was sort of like in the kitchen doing something, and I had my baby brother and was, doing something, but also kind of, aware, like, kind of curious, what's the board gonna say?
Hmm.
And the board like said that it was the name of this child. And to be perfectly honest, I don't remember if my sister and I knew at the time. I can't remember the sequence, if the grave had been discovered before or after we were playing with this. So it could have been our own minds controlling it to spell out the word
Hmm.
Elise. But we spelled out this word. My sister swore she wasn't moving it. I know I wasn't moving the planchette, and it spelled out Elise. We said, "What is your name?" You say, "Is anybody there?" Yes. "What is your name?" And then they spell out their name, and she spelled out the name Elise. And I'll tell you, my mom, her face went white, and she walked over and she pretty much snatched the board up and tucked it under her arm. And I don't know, she says she burned it after that because she became afraid that whatever it was, she didn't actually think if it was the spirit of the little girl, she realized that we had actually made contact with something. But she was more concerned that we had made contact with something that wasn't actually the spirit of the little girl, that it was something greater or more vast or more terrifying that two little girls couldn't handle. um
So, I mean, I guess this is the beginning to every horror movie
I
ever
know,
made.
right?
But I mean, aren't you curious as to what it is first? I mean, how far do you go before you close the
Oh,
cover
well,
on
I'll tell you right now, if I could have found that damn board, I would have been on it immediately alone,
it?
late at night with a
Oh,
candle, of course, like, come on.
Exorcist Part 2, starring Varla
Yeah,
Ventura.
yeah. I didn't feel afraid. My sister didn't feel afraid. It wasn't a fear thing, but we didn't have the choice. And then my mom she said something to us along the lines of, "You're just not." I don't think she might have said something annoying like, "You're not ready for this," or something like that. But
Yeah.
the real gist of it was that she just said that it's something. It could be something that you don't understand. It could not. We were like, "But that was the little girl, whatever." And she said that you don't know that that's what it was, and it was a mistake for me to give this to you. And we were like, "Come on, mom, that's so unfair. You're the worst."
What's your opinion of
And
Ouija boards nowadays?
I
Do you
don't
share it?
have one.
Don't have one.
I don't have one. I have used them on numerous occasions. I did stop using them when I was in my early, I guess, like my uh, when I was a teenager. I had kind of a weird experience where, uh, I may have even told you this story, but basically, I was on a psychotropic substance, and I was in the basement of a haunted old grubby Victorian using a Ouija board alone. And it was really a weird experience. I was under the influence, so I can't tell you what of that was real and what was imagined. But there were things moving around the room, and it was really actually very scary. And so I have used one a couple times since then. It didn't turn me off from the Ouija. And that, I think, that was just my own idiocy for, doing something so mind altering and then trying to dabble in the psychic arts at the same time. It's like I wasn't in like a sweat tent out in the woods. I was like in a grubby basement, drinking and doing acid. So this is why people don't want me around their children, I guess.
Well, past drug
Except my
experiences don't
own.
make you a bad person.
No, they,
Um,
they make you uh, probably in some ways a better parent because you are more aware of the vulnerability, right? Because you remember, like, when I was that age, actually, I was doing bad things. So I'm going to keep my eye on you.
Scary. Yeah, I've got two of them too. They're so far away from that, but yeah, again, it's not really that far away.
Oh, I've got my son's birthday party tomorrow too, so I'm like, okay, there's so many little things that you think you don't have to do, and then you have to because it's just so important. They need to see the balloons and all the little magic things, and
So You have had conversations with, I mean, that was your best on their psychotropic drug of choice, or have you had good ones
I've had
sober?
other things. Oh, I've had sober. No, I'm just kidding. Yes, I have. I have had sober psychic experiences, a number of them. I've had, I'm trying to think of like the most recent one. I've had things where I've been interviewing and there's been knocks on the wall repeatedly. I've been talking about ghosts or whatever, and then I keep hearing this tapping, and I'm feeling all distracted, and then I found actually in the apartment that I lived in San Francisco, which was this old kind of like top floor attic apartment. After I had my child and I brought my child back to that apartment, I found that little things that had happened before seemed to increase. Toys going off in the other room, hearing like voices, feeling cold spots. And then one night I was, you've got, how old are your kids? Like two, right?
There could be three.
Three. Okay. So that like you're in that zone. You just, they're finally sleeping, but you're so fine tuned to the cries in the night that you don't actually sleep. Like when you lay down and they're in the other room, you're kind of like you're hyper tuned to it. And so one night I was sort of like had just finally drifted off and woke up to it felt like something like an icy liquid dripped in the middle of my forehead. That's the
Hmm.
best way I can describe it. And I woke up and I immediately thought there's a leak, right? Because I'm on the top floor. Like my roof is leaking and something just dripped on my forehead. Like if you've ever had like something minty and it touches your skin and the way it kind of lingers, right? And it was right in the middle of my forehead. And it was like a tap, it really hit hard enough that it woke me up. And I kind of sat up and I thought, oh, okay, like what the hell is going on? The roof is leaking. That sucks. And I'm thinking logically, because you always think logically in these situations. It's not until later that you realize something kind of paranormal might have happened. But
Uh-huh.
there's I'm thinking, is the roof leaking? Like that sucks. I got to make sure nothing, I'm gonna get up and make sure nothing's leaking in the crib, right? Because that's worse. So I'm looking around, and then I realized that, okay, it's like California's in a drought. There's no rain. What could have leaked? And I'm kind of looking at the ceiling. I don't see any drops. I don't see anything. So I put the light on. I had to put the light on. Looking around, I still don't see anything. And then this is gonna like totally freak you out. But then I like heard, and I'm still feeling this tap. It really felt like someone thumped me on the forehead. And then I heard my son like giggle. And I just was like, oh my God. Like, so of course I had to get up and check on him. But my thought was like, there's something mischievous in the house and it woke me up and now it's making my son laugh. Your mind just goes into that like horror film scenario immediately. Um, that was kind of a more recent thing that happened, but I just like I've had a lot of little things like that. I've been places and felt taps or had something kind of wake me up out of a dream. The something sitting on the bed. I had that happen. So I lived in the top floor of this Victorian, and for many years I lived in the front, like kind of tiny little apartment. And then when the back one came open, um, I moved to that back one, and it said at one point that was all the same space, but of course over the years it had been divided up. And
Hmm.
when I lived in the front one, I had all kinds of stuff happen. And there was one night where something sat on my bed, and I woke up thinking, oh, the cat's on my bed. And then I remembered that I didn't have a cat. And then I remembered that I was alone and there was something on my bed. And so I kind of sat up and was like, oh my God, okay, what was that? And then I was like, oh, it was just nothing. I was dreaming. And I laid back down and started to drift back to sleep. And I felt it again, Bryan. You never want to feel it twice. And then I was like, there is no way. And I think I felt it a third time. And it was very like something was pressing down on the bed. There was no way to, like someone was sitting on the edge of the bed. And I eventually just, put the light on and was like, okay, I'm not going to be able to sleep with this. Like, no, knowing that every time I fall asleep, this is going to happen. And for some reason, the light helps, right? You put the light on and it's like, well, I'll be able to see it. But I had a lot of things like that. I never saw any kind of like person manifest or anything like that, but a lot of, waking up with like a feeling of something on your chest or sitting on the bed, something completely like crashing or falling when you're in the other room, just a lot of little weird little things like that.
What I really appreciate about our conversations is you can get really deep into the literary theory. W- I mean, we're past an hour, we're at like an hour and 12 minutes right now, so I understand if you want to nip it, but I'm curious, do you have a literary theory about ghosts and things that go bump in the night, like you do about, Christmas and,
Yeah.
Valentine's Day?
I think we've touched on the root of it, and that is that there's a fear that we will die. And so we must then believe that there's something beyond this, that there's a way, that it's a comfort to think that our loved ones might come back to visit us. It's a comfort to think that we may be able to control these things. And even in horror or other kind of supernatural stories, there is a certain comfort in the idea that it is out of our hands, that in the end, it's out of our hands. And it has the same level of comfort as giving it up to God in many, many ways, right? And I think that that's why it's such a deep topic in literature, because like all of the arts, literature especially is trying to explore those very, very deep reaches of our psyche and our understanding. And death is our greatest fear enemy. We're constantly fighting time and death and wrinkles and, impending doom and not getting everything in order, and, the sorrow of losing people and all of these things. And so we're also constantly trying to exercise those demons and those fears. And so I think that there's nothing like a ghost story to make you, as scary as it may be in that moment, it there's a comfort there, because you are still left with that. It's a way that even like non-believers can think there may be something to this. There may be something in the great beyond. There may be a great beyond. Yeah, which, how are we going to know that? Well, I'll come and I'll wiggle a light on midnight into your room, or you know what I
Hmm.
mean? Like we have
Hmm.
no real way of knowing. We have a
Let me
lot of.
reassure you with my death that there is something for you after yours.
Yeah, and that there is something that I'm waiting for you, that we're gonna like, it's the same concept as heaven, or there's a great party and we're all celebrating together because we made it through to this next stage or whatever it is. And there's so many different ideas about that, but I think you have with the ghost story, and then you do have, of course, the same thing you have with a lot of the supernatural stories like werewolves and vampires and dark fairies in the woods, and don't go into the bog. It's like, just stay here, keep your doors locked, don't go wandering into the woods where like a bear could eat you. So always a certain of like, keep everybody close, and keep watch on them. But I also think there's some, like, what about the idea that your heart starts to race. There's adrenaline pumping. Like, I actually read this hilarious and super awesome article that said that you can actually burn more calories watching a horror movie than like a romantic comedy because you're on edge the whole time. So
Makes
it's
sense to me.
the horror movie diet, right? And yeah, it totally makes sense. So I think there's something about that too, right? Like the idea that you are you're scared and it's doing something in your body. It's firing neurons in your brain. It's getting your heart racing. It's giving you this idea of like, we go around and we've got guns and alarms and, all of these things to like protect ourselves. But what are you going to do when it can walk right through the wall? Like nothing, right? There's nothing you can do about that.
Well, I mean,
So
you can acknowledge that there aren't many ghost murders.
people do die. People do die of fear, though. I
Yeah,
mean,
I
people can
guess.
die of fear. They usually, it's usually like cardiac arrest or whatever. But
It's
you
very
could
interesting
be
because, I
so
mean, if
scared
you
that you
believe, you believe. There's nothing that anybody's going to do to change your mind about ghosts and whatever have you. But if you don't believe, it takes a lot to change your mind.
every good ghost story starts out like this, Brian. I have always been a skeptic, but I have to tell you about this time,
Hmm.
something that happened to me.
They're the
Every
most
good ghost story
believable
starts out like that
protagonists.
because then I am identifying with you just on a literary level.
I'm
I
with
am
you. I
identifying
didn't
with
believe
you,
early.
the skeptic, the
Before we started
disbeliever.
this, I did not believe, but now I do. And let me
Exactly.
tell you why.
Yeah, and let me tell you why. I mean, not in exact those words, but that's the gist, right? Is like,
Hmm.
I and always the protagonist is always the skeptic, the outsider, the person who didn't quite, think that this could be possible and tries to apply science or, logic to the situation and maintain calm and all of that kind of stuff. But as a literary device, you know, uh, we're going to get into that. Like as a literary device, a ghost is like genius, right? It's your catch-all. It is
Yeah.
like your any plot hole you have, you stick a ghost in it if you do it right. If you stick ghost or supernatural, and I'm not saying that this is the only way to do it or the best way to do it, but you have lots of examples of that. It's like that explains so much if you can say it was a ghost or you can say it was something supernatural or paranormal. So as a literary device, the idea like fear is a wonderful literary device, and ghosts are a wonderful literary device, or any kind of sort of supernatural presence that will close it up nice and neat, right? Like Stephen King, or what he's even got a lot of those supernatural elements, and he makes them real believable because his characters are believable. They just seem like average Joes that this kind of thing wouldn't happen to, but then they start noticing these weird things, and one thing leads to another. So, but it's a nice way to kind of tie that plot up with a nice a bloody little bow. So, and that's horror writing for you.
Yeah. Is there anybody that you like out there right now, horror writing? Do you read fiction at all, or is it just
Yes,
the
I
nonfiction?
primarily when I'm in my down cycle of not researching, I read a lot of fiction for pleasure, and I'm actually a big fan of a lot of these. There's a lot of female writers who are writing right now that are kind of like true crime writers, or not true crime writers, but like I guess it's sort of dark fiction. So there's usually like, a heroine who somehow manages to outsmart the police. So you have everything from like Gone Girl and that kind of idea of like this woman who disappeared, and did she actually disappear? And so there's a kind of a, like solve the mystery kind of element to it. There's like there's just like a little bit Agatha Christie and a lot of rock and roll in there, So those are
Hmm.
kind of the stories that I've been reading. So I'm trying to think of the most recent one that I just finished because I've actually been burning through them. Oh, I just read some story. It's called The River at Night, and it's so what I do is I like dark fiction, so and horror. So if I read something like a review, and then I just put it in like my queue, and then I go to the library and I look up my Amazon wish list or whatever, and I'm not actually always, sometimes I just buy them, but I'll go to the library and I'll look for whatever might be available, and by then I've completely forgotten by the time it's available at the library, it's like I have no idea why I even put it on my
Hmm.
list. So
Hmm.
this one I just read is called The River at Night, And it's basically the story of these four women who have always gotten together every year. It's like the one constant. They get together for like a long weekend and they do this girls weekend. And one of the friends pushes them to go on this whitewater rafting trip in this really, really, really remote part of Maine. And everybody's like, we just want to go to the beach and like drink cocktails. And she, no, this is going to be like a real, exploration for us. And they get on the water, and the whole time I'm reading this, I'm like, why did I put this on my list? Like, this is good writing. It was beautifully written, so I kept reading it. But I was like, this isn't really I'm not really a chick lit kind of gal, so I'm like, this isn't really my kind of thing. And then they hit the river, and then it goes really, really dark, like way darker than I ever imagined it could possibly go. So I highly recommend that. It's called The River at Night. I don't want to say too much because it gives it away, but it goes super dark really, really fast as you would be going down the river. And a lot happens in like the next 200 pages. So.
A river at night does not sound like a fun place to be.
Well, I mean, the
Period.
title's good too, right? So you're like,
Yeah.
okay, I could
Why are
probably
you
do
on the
that.
river at night? I visited Puerto Rico and did the bioluminescence.
Ooh,
It was
coolness.
the climate's actually destroyed it, so it wasn't really fantastic.
It wasn't
But
as bioluminescent as it once was.
I guess that's what they said. It's been very bland over the last few years. The warming of the ocean or whatever has destroyed the creature that does it.
Yep, I've
But
heard that actually, that the bioluminescence is and like pollution in the water can
mhm,
totally affect it and kill it off and
yeah,
dull its shine.
it was still cool though. I just kept thinking about sharks dragging me out of the canoe.
Well, one of the scariest things I've ever done, this is a total derailment here, but one of the scariest things I've ever done had nothing to do with supernatural. But I was in the Amazon jungle and I was staying at this lodge, and it wasn't a tour, but it was like one of those things where you stayed at this, it was like an eco lodge, and it was on this big lake called Lago Sandoval. And what they would do is, they get you up real early and you go out on the boat and you could like see all the monkeys kind of leaping from trees. In fact, their website says guaranteed monkey sightings because there's spider monkeys like everywhere. And you go on these great walks and you learn about the, indigenous botany, and you learn about all the animals and how to, see signs of them. And because we were on a lake, a pretty good sized lake, you would see the flight path of all these incredible birds, parrots, and just, it was amazing. They get you up real early and they put you out on these like pontoons, and you kind of just go out to the middle of the lake and then, get out your binoculars and look around. And, it's like me and a couple of Australians, because anytime you travel, there's always
Always,
Australians, always.
always.
One other like American guy who was this older gentleman who was totally like, he had the full on like khaki vest and the hat. He was like, I'm in the Amazon. It was great. And then a couple from the UK. And so anyway, so that's all. This was like 3 days of doing this. And then on the last night, they roused everyone. They said, meet us in the lodge at, after sunset or whatever, after dinner. They get everybody together and they're like, okay, we're going out on the lake. But we're not going in the pontoon. It's pitch dark, and they put us in these canoes. And so the one I was in was there was like a guide that, I don't know, he was on an internship from the UK or something, and then there was like the local guy. So we had the guy who was indigenous to that area. He grew up in that part of the Amazon,
hmm
and he takes us out, and we're kind of, it's like three canoes, and we're in a group. There's like 3 or 4 people per canoe, and we're out, and it's the dark inky waters, and there's no lights, nothing on. Even the lights in the lodge are like dimmed down. And we go out, and then the first thing that happens is the our guide diverges from everybody else. So the 2 other canoes go on this way, and our guide goes a different way. So we're like, okay, it is dark. And then they basically tell us, well, the reason we're out here is because this is the only time you'll be able to see caiman. If you don't
Ooh,
know,
the it's the
it's the
crocodile.
Peruvian crocodile, yeah.
Oh,
And
I grew up in
then
Florida.
he
Those aren't
turns
fun
his
either at
light
night.
on,
And
and he
there's lights
shines his
everywhere.
light, and we're out, and you just like, you don't see anything, right? And he shines his light, and all you see around you are eyes. I'm not even shitting you,
Mm.
like eyes glimmering back at you of all the caiman that are in the water right there. And you're just, that was, I was like, okay, we're gonna be okay as long as this canoe doesn't tumble over. As long as like
I mean,
nobody hits the water.
what a great
And
conclusion
and
to a podcast.
you're low to the ground, right? So you're right at their level, and there's just these eyes shining back at you in the most far
Benign
more
way. They don't
terrifying.
care.
Yeah.
They don't care about you one little bit. Fall into the water and they're hungry. Then those eyes come
Yeah. So that's my
delicious.
scariest, that's one of my scariest life
Hmm.
experiences. I mean, I my
Yeah.
heart starts racing just thinking about that because it was such a, I knew I was okay, kind of. There's this part of you that knows you're going to be okay, but then there's this other part of you that it's like, this is totally one of those scenarios that could not be okay. This could be like my end, my demise,
I think you have the
Varla
herd
drowns
mentality
in
though.
Lago Sandoval.
You're not
And
alone. Just make sure the old person's in front of you and you'll be good to go.
somebody who can swim slower.
Just be faster than the slowest person and you'll be fine.
That's just survival.
Survival is important. So June 8th, the book's coming out.
June 1st.
June 1st. Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know where I got 8th from. Something must be happening on the 8th for me. And I don't know. This was interesting. I really enjoyed how meandering the conversation went.
Well,
We
yeah. Well, I
touched
like
briefly on death, and I think
about
that's
death. We talked about mermaids. We talked about, some ghosts and